Hello, everybody, and welcome to This.JavaScript, State of Accessibility. Super happy to have everybody on today. My name is Tracy at Lady Leet. I will be one of your co-hosts today. And let me go ahead and share my screen really quickly so I can do a really quick introduction. I can share my screen. There we go. All right. So, going back up here. So this.JavaScript, what we do is we throw sort of a monthly, quarterly cadence, and it's all about keeping up with the advancements of different frameworks, libraries, browser standards, and different things that are going on. So Marcy Sutton prodded me to do a State of Accessibility, and super excited that so many people were so excited and passionate about accessibility. So thank you so much for This.Labs for sponsoring and letting me spend the time to do things like bring together the JavaScript community. A few different announcements that we have. So we will be having Angular Contributor Days on May 31st coming up very soon. And we'll also be having a Vue Contributor Days happening on June 6th. So this is a really great way if anybody cares about Angular or Vue and cares to get involved within the community or just wants to listen in to people talking about important things within these two different frameworks, feel free to join us. This will be online broadcasted. So I think both of these communities really believe in inclusivity and welcoming everybody in. So please do join us. Visit contributordays.com. And then the State of Browsers, which is our next This.JavaScript event, will be happening on July 17th. Sorry for that pesky Google Hangout stop sharing thing. I can't access it when I'm sharing everything. But we will be having a bunch of the different browsers come together and talk about what's happening in their respective browsers. We've done a few different podcasts on modern web recently. So we just released one related to blockchain. We talked about topics in React with Michael Jackson and Jay Phelps. And we just did another podcast on React Native with some really awesome people who are doing React Native. So definitely check those out if you care to learn more about any of these different topics. Today, we're very lucky to have a few awesome people here. Rob will be sort of co-hosting and giving us the main update on what's happening in accessibility. We have Aderinokun, sorry, Erie, and she's going to be giving some awesome talks as well. Marcy Sutton, Nick Steenhout, Melanie Sumner, Hinton, and Stefan Judis. So this is sort of an idea of what our schedule will be. Rob will be starting off with sort of like the state of accessibility. Then Nick will be talking about WCAG. Suze will be talking about closed captions for live streaming. Marcy will be talking about creating accessible UIs. Erie will be talking about Pally. Melanie will be talking about updates in Ember on accessibility, and Stefan will be talking about the accessibility object model. Then we'll have sort of an open panel where we'll be talking about future accessibility and different things like that, where anybody can ask any questions whatsoever. There's also a live chat open that we will be monitoring, so feel free to also ask questions there. And we'll save all the questions for later, so you can as everybody is talking, you can go ahead and add different things like that, and then we'll go ahead and address those at the very end. In addition to that, if you're on Twitter, feel free to hashtag This.JS. And besides that, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Rob to get started.
All right, thank you. All right, just double checking. No speaker notes showing at the moment. No. I'm going to assume.
Good.
All right, awesome. So yeah, so as Tracy was saying, I want to give kind of a state of the union of web accessibility as I see it. And this is informed entirely by my experience of being a developer advocate at Google and seeing how Google itself is changing, and also working with partners and seeing how those companies are evolving as well. So I feel like companies are starting to get the message that accessibility is fundamental to their design and engineering process. In particular, I'm seeing this from a lot of like larger companies that have, the ability to dedicate resources to it. I think these companies are starting to realize that, accessibility takes work, that it's not something that can be like an afterthought that they just sort of like tack on at the end of their process. And I think that maybe some of them have learned that lesson the hard way. They did a first iteration of a big product or a design system or something like that, got a lot of feedback on it that, hey, this thing is inaccessible. And now that they're at a place where they're doing like the next version of that product or design system, they're like, okay, cool. We've got some hard-won lessons here. Let's make sure that we bake this in from the beginning of our process. I feel like they're also recognizing that accessibility work needs to be sustainable, that it can't just be the domain of like one person on the team, but really the entire team and the entire organization needs to be bought into the idea of building accessible products, and that everyone needs to understand the role that they need to play in that process. I think that the work that Microsoft did over the last couple of years on inclusive design has struck a chord with a lot of companies. And the core of what Microsoft has been getting at here is that, when you design a product for the full range of human abilities, you end up building something that's better for all of your users. But maybe more importantly is when you include a diverse set of users in your design and development process, both as testers and literally as members of the team, you end up fundamentally altering your culture and the way that you build things. And so it becomes more intuitive to do the right thing because it just has to work for everybody on the team. So I think that we're starting to see that we're improving our design thinking. We're making our process more holistic, sustainable, and inclusive. And these are great things. And I see companies sort of like building this into their culture from the foundation. So I see this continuing on into the future, which is really exciting. But on the engineering side of things, I think it's still pretty tough out there, frankly. While the capabilities of the web have advanced a lot over the past few years, and the kinds of experiences that we can build are increasingly rich and interactive, the actual APIs that we have to make those experiences accessible have not really been progressing at the same rate. And so as developers for managing focus, we have tab index, yay. And for conveying semantics, we have ARIA attributes. And these things all have to be manually applied. You have to really, really think through how you're going to use them. And it involves a fairly good understanding of things like semantics and keyboard behavior and things like that to actually do it right. And while the HTML grammar itself is inherently accessible, it actually lacks a lot of the app-like elements that we see in other SDKs like iOS and Android. So we don't have a virtual list recycler view thing like Android has. We don't even have like a cross-browser supported dialogue element yet on the web. We're still trying to get people interested in just using the dialogue tag, right? So it's tough out there. If you're an engineer, even if you want to do the right thing, it can still be a lot of work. But I also see this as a big opportunity. So I feel like in the course of technology, we'll often see things where it feels like stuff is kind of like plateauing a bit. Things are kind of just like inching along. And then suddenly we hit like a big paradigm shift, and you get this explosion of creativity and advancements. And I think on the engineering side of accessibility, we're starting to see a number of really interesting areas, which are right now, today, just starting to develop. And I'm excited about all these things. So for instance, Accessibility Object Model, or AOM, which is a new set of APIs being proposed today. We're going to be hearing more about that later today from Stefan. Machine learning and vision, right? We're starting to see companies put out proof of concepts using these tools to help accessibility. So that's really interesting. And then we've got increasingly powerful testing tools like Pally and Axe, which help developers quickly recognize when they've made a mistake on their page, accessibility-wise, and it says like, hey, you need to fix this. And by the way, here's how you can go fix this. And so it wouldn't surprise me in the future if we start to see even combinations of these things, right? Like Axe or Pally using machine learning and AOM to better inform developers when they've made a mistake on their page or something like that. So this is one of the reasons why, as an engineer, I continue to really enjoy working on accessibility, because I think it's where some of the most fascinating and innovative work is being done on the web today. So I'm thrilled that we have this opportunity today to get together and hear from so many amazing folks. As Tracy was saying, we've got a really great lineup of speakers who'll be talking about things they've been working on to help push the web forward, to educate developers so they can build better experiences, and ultimately where they see the space evolving to and progressing to in the years ahead. So I'm super excited to hear from everybody that we have on the list. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to hand it back to Tracy to introduce our first speaker. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was awesome. I'm so excited about the things that are coming up for accessibility. And I forgot to mention, happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Super awesome. It's like the perfect day to do State of Accessibility. Next up, we have Nick Steenhout, who's going to be talking about WCAG.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, WCAG, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is one of the standards that we have to follow to make sure that things are accessible. Now, for those people listening that don't actually know about WCAG, I should tell you a little bit about it. It's the de facto standard that is relied on most in the world to make things accessible. It was developed by the W3C, the same people that have made the HTML standard and other goodies, say ARIA and so on and so forth. So it's quite an important thing to follow. We're looking at things that are split into 4 principles, themselves split into 12 guidelines. That's broken down into 61 success criteria. And then there's a whole bunch of techniques that are associated with those. It's quite a lot of material. Most be part, but we all understand where the information is to be able to go in and get that. So that's quite important to be aware of this. So the 4 principles I think are important, so important that I'm actually wearing them on my shirt. I don't know if anyone can see them. We're talking about perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So when we understand these 4 principles, we really have a basis of understanding everything else that flows on from there. WCAG is broken into 3 different success, 3 different levels. We're talking about A, AA, and AAA. And most regulations, legislations, requirements for accessibility tend to target the AA level. A is really just to entry level in terms of accessibility, which should be usable by a lot of people, but not everyone. AA is really the place to reach, and every time we can include AAA success criteria to improve things, it's good. So that's a nutshell overview of WCAG, WCAG. If you haven't worked with it before, I strongly suggest you head over to Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo, your favorite search engine, and you search for WCAG 2.0, and you will have access to a whole bunch of information about it. It will really influence the way you work if you're caring about making things accessible. So this is the state of things as we are. We're talking about WCAG 2.0. And for the last nearly 2 years now, 18 months, I think, people at W3C have been working on an update to 2.0, which is aptly named 2.1. 2.1 does not replace WCAG 2.0. It actually adds itself to 2.0. So we're talking about adding success criterias to 2.0. We're adding 17 new success criteria. So earlier I was saying WCAG has 61. We're now starting to look at 78 new criteria. These are broken down. There's 5 new criteria at level A. There's 7 new criteria at level AA, and if you do the math, you're left with 5 new level at AAA. I think it's going to be important for us to really focus on these new criterias from now, because as we build things, obviously we probably want to make sure that it's going to live into a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, and we want to future-proof our platforms, our systems, our websites. And while right now, if God forbid you get sued and somebody says you're not accessible, and it goes to court, and the court is going to say, well, you have to make sure you comply with level AA of WCAG 2.0. That's where you're going to be at. But if you're coming in a couple years and you get the same lawsuits, suddenly it's going to be about making things accessible and complying to 2.1. So it's not a bad idea to look at that. And I ran out of time. I just wanted to say quickly, the 17 new criteria really aim at cognitive impairments, dexterity impairments, and low vision to make an improvement to those areas. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And again, if anybody has any questions during this, feel free to go ahead and drop them into the live chat. We're super happy to either answer questions there or wait till later as well. I also dropped the link to the shirt that you're wearing in the live chat, and in case anybody wants to go ahead and check that out. Nick also runs a really awesome ally accessibility podcast, A11y Rules. So if you want to find out more about that, you can follow him on Twitter at @vevroom on Twitter. Or is there a URL that we can check out?
Yeah, the URL for the podcast is A11yrules.com.
Perfect.
And there's actually today a special Global Accessibility Awareness Day panel discussion, so you can check that out as well while you're doing GAD celebrations.
Yay, thank you. Okay, next up we have Suze, and Suze will be talking about closed captions for live streaming.
Awesome, thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen because I have some slides. Okay. Let me know when you can see them.
Yep, you're perfect.
Great. So I'm going to be talking briefly about live streaming and captions. I'll give a little bit of an intro just on the context of what live streaming is and how captions fit into that and what the current state of that is. And a lot of this does focus on web technologies and cloud technologies, so it's still super relevant to a lot of the discussions that we're having today about web accessibility. So if you haven't actually checked out live streaming before, it's a pretty simple but strange concept. Essentially, it's very big in the esports or the gaming scene when you're playing video games. But what you can do is you can share your screen, or you can share the game you're playing on a game console, and you usually have something like a webcam too, so people can watch you. And you basically take all of that and you stream it as a video to a number of different services that support you watching live. So what you're actually watching right now, as we're all presenting, is a live stream. And so this particular one is on YouTube, but you can also send it to other services such as Twitch and Mixer. Twitch and Mixer are more focused around games, but there are a lot of other variety streams as well. And the reason why I'm particularly interested in this is because I do have my own stream that I run on almost every single Sunday. And it's a coding stream. And so this is an old screenshot of one of my streams where you can see I have a coding editor and I have a terminal, and people can just tune in and watch me working on open source, and they can also jump into the chat and interact with me. So it's very, very similar to what you're watching today. So I realized that for those who are watching live, this makes sense, but for those who are catching this stream afterwards, it'll just be a regular video to them. So currently, there are a different selection of applications, both free and paid, open source, non-open source, that people use to stream themselves and their screens to these different services. And so one of them is called OBS Studio. There's another one, for example, called XSplit. There's another called Game Show. And they all have different feature sets. And one feature set that I've noticed that is pretty missing from these programs that people just use mostly on a non-professional sort of live streaming context is live captioning. Now, OBS Studio actually does have experimental captioning support, but it's only available in the Windows version of the app, and you are sort of held to have to use a certain captioning provider, and that provider is the Windows voice recognition system. So it is more of a machine learning algorithm that auto captions it for you. You don't necessarily have the choice to be able to get like a real-time human captioner to plug their captions into that service. And so what's required for captions online is that both the video provider, such as YouTube or Twitch or Mixer, needs to support closed captioning standards in their video player itself, which I know that Twitch and YouTube currently does. And they also have to, you also have to have a way to actually interleave those captions into the actual live stream that you're sending. And so that can be really complicated. It's based on pretty old captioning standards that were initially introduced for things like television signals. So those standards have made it to the web, and it has been pretty difficult to get this going. And I care a lot about closed captioning because, anyone who has hearing difficulties or has English as a second language, or they're watching a video in a language that isn't their first language, can really benefit from captions so that they can actually read the screen. It's the same with going to a noisy bar. You can watch a video and actually be able to read what the people are saying on the actual show. So on my own stream, I have experimented with trying to create closed captions for myself, even though the program I use, OBS, kind of lacks that capability out of the box. And so I played with some Microsoft machine learning, cloud-based services, and I made like a Twitch extension, which is essentially an iframe over the top of your video feed, in order to translate that. Unfortunately, because of technical terms and my accent, I was able to train it to only be about 80% accurate, which is still just not quite there yet, which is a real shame. But I wanted to kind of really briefly talk about where we're currently at with trying to solve this problem, because it really is a super popular medium now, and we are shutting out a lot of people who need these captions in order to access it. So there's a product called Falcon that's put out by Eyeo, and what they do is they take your live stream that you're producing on your computer, they connect that in the cloud to some captioners, and they basically interleave those captions with your RTMP stream, and then that ends up going to Twitch or YouTube or Mixer as a result. And so that does increase the delay, but it is possible to actually get that going, which is really, really cool. Unfortunately, it's still fairly pricey to get this going, and I think that it's not just software support in the actual streaming software people are using locally, it's also just the money involved in doing this. Now, I make a moderate amount of money from my Twitch stream, and that usually just goes back into supporting my stream. I still don't make enough to be able to pay for these services, so I would have to look into something like fundraising. There's also a really cool new service as well that does something similar called AI Media that just came out, and you can see there that they support Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Twitch. They start at around $3 per minute to use their cloud captioning service. So that most live streams are around 2 hours. So that works out to be like $360 just before you even pay your captioner. And then captioners, real-time captioners are highly skilled people. So you're usually looking at least several $100s per hour for that as well. So I guess like my update on how this is going is that we still need to look into whether or not we can use technology to try and make that more affordable, and how we can actually give people the tools that they need in the software that they use, rather than requiring them to buy super expensive captioning encoders and have to use like pro-level live streaming software in order to do that. So I'm excited that we're starting to really see this happening in live with closed captioning and live streaming, but I think we're still a little ways off there. And it's something that I've been following for the last year and a half, and I'm hoping that it gets a little better soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we're all clapping for you quietly. what am I doing? Okay. Sorry, I was playing with the controls and confused myself for a second. Okay, so next up, Marcy will be talking about creating accessible UIs.
Yay! So happy to be here. Great job, Suze and Nick. I really enjoyed hearing your updates, and I'm super excited to hear from everybody today. I'm going to be talking about creating accessible user interfaces, something that I'm really passionate about, frankly, because a lot of us don't consider that, and I wish that we would. So I'm going to share a document that I created. You can see my GitHub gist.
Yep, you're all good.
All right. So if you can find it on my GitHub, just go to gist.github.com/Marcy Sutton, and it should be the latest gist in there. So I just have some resources and some things I want to talk about. I'm going to start a timer since I forgot. Okay. So there's a lot of talk lately about accessibility. Like, how do we remember to add it? How do we make this part of our culture and our workflow? And I think from a practical point of view, making it part of your definition of done, part of the criteria of what makes a quality component should definitely include accessibility. The nice thing is that you don't have to get it all right immediately. There's no expectation for you to just get it right immediately overnight. You can iterate on it and chip away. So every feature that you work on, every section of your website or your application, if you're considering accessibility, each step of the way, and try to just contribute something back for that, you'll make progress over time. And that's really great to see. And it kind of lightens that, fear of, oh my gosh, I don't know everything and I can't do it all at once. Fortunately, also, there's some great documentation out there to help you out. So Nick talked about WCAG. There's a lot of literature that you can read up on, both the guidelines themselves. There's also understanding documentation and like a how to meet guideline or page for each one of those guidelines. And then further, the ARIA authoring practices guide is fantastic. It has lots of examples of common UI widgets, and including how to support screen readers, how to support keyboard navigation, to really help you try and get a hold of all of the requirements for making something accessible. I find those to be really helpful resources, and they help you to hopefully not reinvent the wheel. I think especially in JavaScript land, it's tempting to want to create everything from scratch and flex your creative muscle there. But often those custom solutions are completely leaving out a lot of users and customers. So by referring to WCAG and the ARIA authoring practices guide, you can get a lot of really great tips. And then going one step further, we talk a lot about what's it going to take to get accessibility to become more thought of. And I think it's really about education. Unfortunately, at universities and boot camps, accessibility is not included. I think even in design schools, I was talking to someone about that the other day, that in their design education, there was no accessibility. I also went to art school and there was no accessibility in that degree either. So we have some catching up to do. And those of us who do know some things about accessibility can do a really great service by educating our peers, helping them to bring them along, not a wag of the finger, but a encouragement and a way to get people excited. So making them aware that accessibility matters and that it impacts users every single day is a really great place to start. It's important to note that as developers, you are sometimes not set up for success if accessibility hasn't been considered in design and user experience. So we really want to try and shift accessibility left as far possible as we can, so that we're not just kind of playing a game of whack-a-mole and trying to, I guess, what's the phrase, putting lipstick on a pig? That we need to make sure we're considering it from the beginning as much as possible. That said, as developers, we do have a lot of opportunities to make things accessible. And I like what Rob was saying about the innovation opportunities. I feel that way as well, both with design and development. And once you've got some things in motion, document them. Make sure that your teammates are aware of the requirements, both in written documentation, that's really great. Also in your automated test suite, I find that's a sort of a contract that your teammates can understand. How does this component work? Oh, it's supposed to work with the escape key. You can bake that into an automated test, and it acts as a form of accessibility documentation. It also prevents regressions if you break something or your teammate breaks something. If you have automated test coverage for accessibility, you'll know that someone broke the build. Another area of education is training. If your team is really kind of missing the mark and you feel like you don't have enough expertise in-house, bring in a trainer. There's lots of folks out there who do training, and they can come and help you get your skills, up, similar to how you might bring in a trainer for React or for some technology that's new to your company. Accessibility training is a great way to do that. Also, if you have any champions or experts inside of your company, lean on them to help you gain some accessibility training. Okay, so that's the education piece. I think I am actually out of time now. So you can refer to this gist, but I think some of the key areas that you want to look at are keyboard support, making sure you can tab through everything. There's some other key problem areas, particularly color contrast. Things, really basic things that I hope we can remember, like text alternatives and semantics, to really help you move that forward, using some testing tools like Axe. That's one sort of ecosystem of tools. I know Irie's going to talk about Pally next. That's another solution. And you want to do some manual testing. You can't automate everything. So you want to do some manual testing with screen readers and the keyboard. And then lastly, user testing. It's really enlightening to watch someone try and use your interface that you've made. So with services like AccessWorks, you can be paired up with testers. You should really pay them because it's valuable work. And then the last tip I'm going to give is that there was a really great blog post from the gov.uk folks the other day about what they learned from getting their autocomplete tested for accessibility. So I would recommend checking those things out. So that is it for me.
Cool. Thank you so much, Marcy. That was super awesome. I love the silent claps from everybody. We're like, yeah, this is great. Okay, so let me go ahead and there we go. Okay, so next up, we will have Eyeo be talking about Pally. Really, really cool project.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Pally, which is a tool for testing accessibility that I really enjoy using. Let's see if I can share my screen. Can you guys see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So Pally is a tool that you can use it in a bunch of different ways. So I'm just going to show one, which is a way you can use it in continuous integration, which is really accessibility testing kind of baked into your process. So if something doesn't pass an accessibility test, then it shouldn't be deployed. So one of the reasons I really love Pally is because you can do really, really simple testing and just give in a URL like what you have here and just have it give you like the critical information or as much information as you want. But you can also really build it up to testing really complex interactions. So I'm just going to show you how it kind of works. So I have this Pally CI file here, and all you have to do is just run the command, Pally CI. Hopefully this will work. So it just looks at the URL, and then what it'll do is spit out any of the critical errors. So there are different levels that it can show you. So these are the errors like I mentioned, but you can also get warnings, which are things that you would get to after you fix the errors. And it can also show you notices, which are really important because those are things that you'd probably want to test manually yourself and not necessarily things that can be automated. So this, for example, is telling me that the image element on this doesn't have any alt text. So that's something that's critical and you should try and fix. So I'm just going to copy some snippets so I don't have to spend time typing. So this is just how you could show all the different types of notices that you can get. So like I said, that you have the errors, then you can also have notices and warnings. So as we can see here, I have like a bunch of other information. So this is an example of a notice. It just says that check that the link text combined with programmatically determined link test. It's basically just saying that check that the text of the link actually describes the purpose of the link. So that's something that can never be automated. That's something that you actually have to manually test yourself. So that's why I really like Pally as well, because it kind of prompts you to do those extra things that you might, because you might feel like if you fix all the errors, that means everything is 100% done, which it never is. And you always have to go back and check manually as well. So let me just copy more things. So another great thing that you can do with Pally is when you're trying to search on a page or trying to vet a page, hide particular elements that you don't want to see any errors or notices or anything to do with. So the first time that I ran this, just do that again. A bunch of the errors I got were actually to do with carbon ads, because I have this carbon ads widget on my site here. And that's not something that I can personally fix. So maybe you don't want that to be part of, you don't want to see those errors because that's not something you can fix. And also things like the screen reader only class. So it was giving me a bunch of warnings to do with contrast ratio and saying that this element is invisible, but that was actually intentional. So I don't want to see those errors either, because that might actually stop, if you're using it in continuous integration, it might actually stop your page from being deployed. So you have that level of flexibility. You can say you don't want to see particular elements. And going back to the web content accessibility guidelines, you can also have flexibility on specific guidelines that you do or you do not want to like have errors or warnings about. So you can get really granulated with how you want to configure your Pally file. And finally, I just want to show how you can get even more, how you can do even more with it. So for example here, before I just had one URL, and you probably don't want to test just your homepage. You want to test many different pages. And you can go about this different ways. So one way you can do it is to pass it in a sitemap, and it will just crawl through all the pages on the sitemap. But another thing you can do is specify a list of URLs, and you can also have specific settings for each of those URLs. So for example, on the homepage, what I've just done here is taking a screenshot of the homepage. And that's really useful for particularly sites like single page applications, where you just want to make sure that all the content has actually loaded. So it's useful to have like a screen capture, so it can just show you an example of what came up. So I can see that the page actually fully loaded, and this is what was actually tested. You can also simulate actions, which is probably the most powerful feature of this. So I have a page where users can subscribe to the blog. So apart from taking a screen capture, I've also had here a set of actions that I want Pally to kind of go through. So here is just the ID of the field where a user will put in their email, then you have their name. So I can do all these things, and I can also simulate clicking buttons and making sure that the form has actually submitted. And I can also override some of the default settings that I have here. So if we go back, I was trying to hide the carbon ads, screen reader only. But on an actual article page, I wanted to also not look at the discuss thread, for example. So it's really, really powerful. You can do pretty much anything you can think of. And it's really easy to know. What I always recommend people, if you're just getting started, just start with something that as simple as just giving it a simple URL, and you can always build up from there. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. There's so much love in the accessibility world. Y'all are such positive people. This is great. Okay, So next up, we are going to have Melanie talk about accessibility in Ember and give an update on that.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody.
We can see your screen. Tomster looks adorable in that cute shirt. Tomster and Zoe. Yes.
I'm very, very happy. We got to release these at EmberConf this year, and I have stickers. So if anybody wants stickers, just DM me your address, and I'll get those sent out. I think they're perfect additions for your laptop. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Ember to make accessibility better, a better experience. You can find me on Twitter or GitHub. I'm a member, the newest member of the Emberjs core team and the Ember learning team, and I also help co-organize the Ember Chicago meetup. And we also got mascots done this year for Chicago, so that's been really fun. So EmberConf had a lot of talks about accessibility this year, which I thought, oh, this is really great. We had talks about how to make your forms accessible. We had talks about better accessibility through better tests. I gave a talk about accessibility with lots of superhero references in which the standards are the superheroes, not the developers, just to make that clear. That was a really fun talk to give. Even the EmberConf schedule demo app was accessible itself, and it came up in nearly every single talk this year. So that was a really great experience to watch that happen live. As of today, right now, some other things that are going on. Ember has had this div wrapping its app and inserted into the body, and we've all had that complaint about single page apps for years. But now in Ember, it is an optional feature to remove it. We want to move forward in the future and remove it entirely for everyone. But as of right now, you no longer have to put that into your applications, which means your landmarks are going to be improved. We also have an add-on if you need to keep it, which adds those roles in there for you. We also have a number of ARIA and accessibility A11y add-ons that you can find on Ember Observer to help your components and your apps be a lot more accessible. We have a lot of great help and support in our Ember community Slack chat. That's very Ember specific, which has been a really great experience. And I've been working on improving the accessibility of the Emberjs.com website itself, which has been a really rewarding experience. Ember Orange is surprisingly hard to make accessible because of the color contrast checks. So that's been fun. And then what are our goals? So as a team, we want to increase the internal developer awareness of the accessibility add-ons that already exist to help you now. We have an RFC in by Jamie White to improve the accessibility of our applications through semantic test selectors. And that RFC, anybody can go read it and make comments and all that. It's a really encouraging, it's a really beautiful RFC, and it's a really incredible topic to just read through it and kind of digest. Jamie has a great way with words. And I'm excited about this one. I'm excited about the commitment of the core team to let assistive technology know when a route has changed. Right now we've got Ember A11y add-on or A11y announcer add-ons that can do that in similar but different ways. But the commitment to get this into Ember by default. And that's, gosh, gives me chills kind of to talk about. It's really exciting because that's not there right now. And hearing the conversation, just like, well, we might have to go talk to the people who work on the browsers or people who work in assistive technology. Maybe that hook's not there yet, but we'll get it done. That's super exciting. And that's it. So thank you.
Yay, thank you so much. And I think everybody is desperate for one of those amazing Tomster stickers. They are so cute. Okay, so last up, we have Stefan, who's going to be talking about the accessibility object model. And then we have been collecting a bunch of questions through the live chat. So we will address those questions. And again, feel free to keep asking questions on Twitter. But besides that, I'll go ahead and introduce Stefan.
Cool. Thank you much. Thank you very much. Let me quickly start the timer because we're on sharp here. Let me share my screen. Cool. Does that work?
Yep, you are good.
I'll give a sneak peek on the future. The accessibility object model, really, really quick. So understand what this is, we have to kind of look at how assistive technology works today. So how this works is that usually people request an HTML document and then the DOM tree is created. And then there's JavaScript that interferes with the DOM tree. And then the DOM tree is the base for what we actually see and the base for a so-called accessibility tree. The accessibility tree is what interacts with assistive technology. And as we're living in a really JavaScript-heavy world today, we've got one problem here. Actually, we cannot really access or interact with the accessibility tree from JavaScript today. And this is where the accessibility object model comes into play. So that's a JavaScript API to allow developers to modify and explore the accessibility tree. So what does that actually mean? So the first thing is that there will be a way to set ARIA tags. So for example, when you look at the checkbox and you inspect the whole thing with the Chrome DevTools, you see that there's a lot of information actually in the checkbox. So you see the accessibility tree there, and you see that it has a checked value and a role checkbox. And this works basically quite well out of the box. But now we're kind of in the world of custom elements, and we see a beautiful SVG toggle here. And when we inspect that, we actually have the problem that this is basically nothing. So, and you may know that you now could use ARIA to make this a little bit more accessible. And it turns out that this then works, but it's maybe not the best approach when you're in a JavaScript-heavy world. So currently, web components and custom elements are forced to use ARIA to declare, for example, default semantics. And the accessible object model will give us an interface so that we can define these things. So this little snippet here actually works in Chrome today. But actually, the spec changed. So this is what you should use. And with this, we can just use this custom element, and we have the accessibility in place. But just a little reminder here, just because it is announced as a checkbox in the accessibility tree, you see there that I will press a lot of keystrokes or keys to actually toggle this checkbox. This is not actually working. So creating custom elements or custom components is always really, really hard. This is just to keep in mind. Also, what is included in the new specs are new events. So for example, when you have a slider and you use, for example, a screen reader on your phone, there might be the possibility that the user can decrease and increase the slider value with the volume buttons. Now think of a custom element there. There's no way to get these kind of interactions today. And this is where a set of new events will come into play for clicking, increasing, decreasing values, selection. And then in the future, we can do something like this, so that we can also react to assistive technology and actions that are triggered by these. Rob has an excellent screencast about that, so check that out. And another thing are then virtual nodes. I mean, what you see there is A-frame. And this is an interface that is interactive, and it has some elements to click. But when you look at the whole thing, it's basically just a canvas element. There's no way to see or to understand that there are actually clickable elements included in there. And this is where accessible nodes or virtual nodes will come into play. So you can then just, even if the DOM does not have these nodes, you can attach these to the accessibility tree in the future. Another example that is inside of the spec is this tic-tac-toe example, which is a build with a canvas element. But as we're kind of cutting edge, I checked that yesterday, it crashes Chrome right now. So you have to be careful when you want to play with these. And also, the spec defines that you actually have access to the accessibility tree at all. So for example, when we look at this markup, and I'm defining a role super button here, I have no way to check if this actually is valid, and if this goes into the accessibility tree and actually has some value. With a new function that is called getComputedAccessibleNode, we will have access to the accessibility tree, which is super, super, super cool. I'm running 30 seconds over. So this new API is great for testing and feature detection later on. So the spec is in progress, so you have to be careful there. Implementation and implementation details are also future stuff, and you will find the spec here. And the maintainers there also have a nice little support table there, so you know what is going on. And I think this is really cool. And so, yeah, the accessibility object model is really cool, but probably have to wait a little bit until we can use it. And just really quick, I want to announce something. We do the Accessibility Club here in Germany. And we will do a conference in November, and we already have some speakers. So when you're in Berlin, November 5th, that is the day before Beyond Tellerrand, we do a whole day with accessibility stuff, and it will be great. So maybe you want to join there. And this is it.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited about all these different things y'all are doing, because, you know, these are the things that are basically pushing the web forward. So it's really, really, really exciting again to hear what everybody's doing. And I think the passion, especially to see things like Ember taking such a good stance on it, and really, you know, now I'm wondering, hey, you know, what is Vue doing? What is Angular doing? What is React doing for accessibility? So I think we're moving on now to the panel questions. And Rob, I know you've been compiling a bunch of different things and super active on live chat. Thank you so much. And again, please feel free to continue asking questions.
Yeah, I have tons of stuff here. So how long? By the way, how long do we have for the whole panel section?
Oh yeah, we have like an hour, so you're good.
Oh,
yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Right,
so
awesome.
Feel free to everybody. You know, this is very open. Like, don't feel like you have to wait your turn or whatever. Y'all are such great rule followers, but we really want this to be, you know, a great open discussion on these types of things, and really encourage some of the conversations, hopefully, that continue on the internet.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just sort of go through this list. The first one that we saw earlier was on WCAG 2.1. So Scott was asking, WCAG 2.1 is a recommendation soon-ish, right? We're not quite there all the way. So should we start using this at our companies to test against today? And I guess we should start with Nick on that one.
Yeah, we're looking at June for reaching recommendation stage. And I would certainly say that you should start looking at implementing 2.1 in anything that you want to future-proof. It's going to come in pretty much as is. Maybe a comma here is going to change, or a word there is going to change, but the basic of these new success criteria are going to be implemented. So I would strongly offer to 2.1 now.
Can you repeat the last part of that? I think you dropped out of it.
Sorry about that. Bad hotel Wi-Fi. I would really recommend for anyone who is building stuff that is going to be used in a year or 2 or 3 to start implementing 2.1 now.
Okay, got it. And so this is a question for you, Nick, as well as like other folks on the panel. If my organization is like just getting started with WCAG, like how would you recommend we actually go about testing our product?
The first thing I would do is I would do a lot of reading. And while in general, I don't really subscribe to the idea of checklist, accessibility checklist, when you're really just started, it's good to have a checklist that you're just going through and you're building your own workflow, and just take it, one step at a time and go through testing all the level A's first, and you get comfortable with that, and then testing level AA's, and reach out to people that are doing accessibility. If you use the A11y hashtag on Twitter, you can ping that, and a lot of people follow that. You'll get answers. You can also get on the accessibility Slack if you have questions, and a lot of people are going to be very happy to participate. And maybe somebody can throw the link to the accessibility Slack on the chat so people can get there.
It is web-a11y.herokuapp.com. I'm the admin.
Thanks, Marcy.
I was also going to say, Melanie had a great comment in our speaker chat that there is the Axe plugin for Chrome and Firefox. You can see the tags of which WCAG success criteria a rule maps to, or if it's a best practice. So that's a way that you can get something to point out problems to you rather than referring to the giant list of WCAG success criteria to start out.
Yeah, another thing. Sorry, I'm like going in between chats and everything. So sorry if this was mentioned already. But another thing that I think is super useful is the ARIA authoring practices guide for folks. Marcy, did you just mention that? Or am I totally like repeating what you said?
In my 5 minutes piece,
right.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason why I find it so helpful is it is very component focused. So it'll be like, hey, if you're building a particular UI widget, on the left-hand side, it'll show you the UI pattern. You pick one, and it'll describe the keyboarding support, the ARIA support, and things like that. The reason why I feel like this is a good tool to sort of like on-ramp people is because it's very like digestible. Like if you're just like building a component, you're kind of just getting started in accessibility, but you've been intimidated by something like ARIA because it's just like, oh man, there's so many like attributes and I don't know what they all do. That resource is so great because it's like, hey, look, if you're building a tab strip, like here is like what you need to grok to kind of like do that. And that for me was really helpful to sort of like on-ramp into ARIA and start to understand like, okay, I understand now what these attributes do and how they work. And from there, could then start like broadening the horizon a bit and looking at other things like WCAG and understanding that stuff a lot better. So that was very helpful for me. Okay, wait, I forgot that I'm also the question asker. All right, another question was, where can we get the poor shirt that Nick is wearing?
Oh yeah, I put the link in chat.
I tweeted it like a while ago. It's on Marcy Sutton. It is on a site called Redbubble. It's made by Alice Boxall, one of Rob's colleagues at Google. So yeah, the redbubble.com, if you just search for perceivable, I think it's just poor, P-O-U-R.
I'll actually put it in the description of this event so that people can find it later on as well.
I might go back in there later. There's a couple of other really great accessibility shirts. There's one that I think you can get for another week or two that says accessibility matters. That one is beautiful.
Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a shirt called Accessibility Cats, A11y Cats. And there was, there we go. Nice. It's being worn right now. There was a first print run that was done, and I am breaking news. It's going to be available at print on demand at a11y.store. The store is going live today or tomorrow.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm also secretly working on one that just says Shadow DOM ruins everything, because if you do accessibility and web components, you're just like, no, constantly foiled by Shadow DOM.
Yep.
But we're doing a lot to improve it, but gosh, it's tough right now. Okay.
I'll take one of those shirts, Rob.
Yeah, they're gonna sell out fast.
For anyone that actually works with Shadow DOM, yeah, I bet.
Yeah. Okay, so Jonathan Poole asked, this is a pretty big question. How do graceful degradation and progressive enhancement as two development principles relate to accessibility? So that is a big one. Any takers?
I mean, we could start by talking about the difference between the two. I just had to look this up. It's like, one, you're starting by having a baseline of something that works, and you kind of like layer things on top. And then it's sort of like the inverse. So I guess graceful degradation would be if you're starting with the fancy thing and then you kind of like, I don't know, it just degrades. To say my definition in the definition, it degrades gracefully. But it's basically like a kind of opposing viewpoint. So it's like, where do you start? You start with the static site and then add kind of like sugary goodness on top of it? Or do you start with, your JavaScript heavy app and then try and work the other way? So I think you kind of have to pick one, and it might depend on what kind of an app or a site you're working on. But the gist is that you should not just make it, JavaScript only and then a blank screen. Having your core user flows have some sort of support is so great. Because then if JavaScript fails to load, like, what was that statistic from BuzzFeed? Like, they have such high traffic that even a small percentage of requests, if JavaScript fails to load, if you get a blank screen, that's a lot of users with a blank screen. So I think it is very important, especially in more robust, higher traffic web properties.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's also an opportunity for doing, like, if things like server-side rendering can help you a bit here, because at least possibly you can send down more of an experience versus just like a JS file with a body tag and hope things work out.
Yes.
So at Eyeo, my teammate Eric Beidelman did a pretty interesting talk on using Puppeteer, which is a sort of like an automation tool for headless Chrome, like running that on the server to statically render your JS heavy site. So folks look up, I want to say it's just called like headless browsers or something like that at Google I/O on YouTube from the most recent I/O a couple of weeks ago. Check that talk out. It's very interesting on sort of quickly ramping up on something like server-side rendering. I thought that was pretty neat.
Yeah, I would second the server-side rendering as a good approach for that, because then you're, delivering something from the server. I think you still have to prioritize what's a core user flow. Like, even with accessibility testing, we often start with core user flows just because you only have limited time and resources. So if you really nail the essentials, you're in a lot better shape than doing nothing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's something I've like also been trying. I've sort of like learned this internally from teams at Google and how they triage and prioritize the accessibility work that they want to do. They tend to categorize things in terms of like primary user journey and secondary user journey. And they're like, all right, like what we really need to nail first is every step of a primary user journey. And that might be like multiple pages, but they think of that as almost like one discrete thing. And they're like, we have to make sure the entire flow for the journey is accessible. So that's helpful. I mean, beyond just this topic, but also if you're just wondering like how to prioritize your own accessibility work, I found that methodology pretty useful. Okay, this is a fun one. So Jonathan asked, how should companies testing and developing for accessibility deal with the UA or the user agent in the browser landscape? There are so many screen readers and versions of them, it's almost impossible to decide what to target.
The spec tells you code to the spec. So that's what we do. We code to the spec. We keep track of, okay, it doesn't work in this browser screen reader combination. We decided which ones we're going to support. So we support Firefox and NVDA, JAWS and IE, VoiceOver in Safari. And we don't really, we kind of just back burner any combination of those that is not standard in, for what we're going to support. Just because I think some of them are meant to support things in specific ways when they first started out. So we're dealing with like limitations of the browser and the sister technology as well. So coding to spec is my #1 piece of advice.
And I guess my follow-up question is kind of have we seen other frameworks and libraries doing things related to accessibility or making it sort of a first-class priority? Like Rob Palmer, I don't know, maybe.
Marcy.
Yeah.
Marcy's done a lot.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah, Angular, I know Marcy worked with them, and then they're currently working on a revision of their material. Like, as we're updating material design, there's folks within there that are doing new iterations on material design components. I think that there's definitely more work that needs to be done in this space. I think frameworks are doing, they're doing a decent job, but there's always room for improvement. One thing that I think is potentially very interesting and very helpful is AOM lets you look at the computed accessibility tree that the browser is about to hand off to assistive technology. So as the person asking the question, or as Jonathan asked, it's like there's so many different combinations. Like, how do we figure out like how to sort of like normalize that? What I'm really interested in doing is being like, okay, well, can we at least start with the accessibility tree that the browser is about to hand off to assistive technology? And as we start to, if every browser ships AOM, we can then actually identify inconsistencies between the accessibility trees and the browsers themselves. So for instance, if I make a tab strip and Chrome says, oh yeah, like I report it this way in the accessibility tree, and then like maybe Safari reports it a different way and Firefox is a different way, that immediately gives us a place as developers to ask these browsers, like, hey, can we at least have one sort of uniform way of representing that tree before you hand it off to assistive technology? Then when we're testing our components, we can say, all right, well, I at least can maybe assert that like cross-browser, the browser's accessibility tree looks correct. I can't necessarily say yet how the AT is going to interpret that, but that gives me potentially a starting point. So that's something I'm really interested in for like the future of accessibility testing.
And just quickly coming back to the question about frameworks, Dojo 2 version 2 was just released, and it's dojo.io, dojo.io, and a lot of their components that they've released as part of their toolkit framework is accessible out of the box. And so they've taken that multiplier effect of, if you use our components, you're going to have a certain standard that's already reached on that too, which I think is really cool. I want to see more frameworks taking that on, and I'd like to see more third-party components made for other frameworks to have some kind of checklist of standards that that framework community actually adheres to whenever they're creating these reusable components as well. I know Shadow DOM issues aside, but it's been really encouraging to see that from Dojo, to be honest, and it's right there on their front page, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I'd second that about Dojo. I know there was a lot of effort put into Angular material, especially, I worked on Angular 1. I know the Material 2 team and 2+, they're on like version 6 now or something. There's a lot of effort there. I think one area that always could use improvement is documentation in frameworks. The React team has a great accessibility document. I'm still kind of waiting for the Angular 6 version of that. So go chime in with support, go open issues. If you find demos, patterns on framework sites, on UI libraries, go open issues and give them suggestions of how to fix it in the nicest way you can. Again, with the trying to avoid the wag of the finger, but it really helps spread the awareness around if collectively, when we all go look up these UI components, if we can identify issues and help them try to fix them, that's like every single issue you open is helping to spread awareness. So that's what I try to do, but we all have limited time. So if we collectively do it, maybe we can make a dent.
Yeah, we also have accessibility. So Jen Luker, she works with us on the RxJs learning team to make sure that there are our docs are accessible. So before we actually do any releases, we have her do a pass-through to make sure that everything is good, which has been super awesome. So I think a lot of people, y'all out there who are developers, don't realize that you can actually make a big difference by just, submitting PRs or commenting on different things that you think matter, and everybody listens, right? So do that. Even if they don't listen the first time, they'll listen the 10th time.
The hammer principle, right?
Do it nicely too.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true though, right? Like accessibility so often gets deprioritized for like other features, but if there are people actively asking for it on GitHub, right, and plus oneing, well, not doing the +1 comment, but the little thumb thing on the GitHub thing, the GitHub message, like that helps people triage, and so it's important to make sure you're doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think also you can just practice this whole idea that like, hey, open source is open to everybody. So if you want to practice more and get more excited about accessibility and just get into it, and you can't do it at work, let's say, or something like that, you can just go look at the docs for everything exciting related to open source and just submit PRs.
Yeah, I'd say on the kind of line of opening issues, if you can say how it impacts users, that really helps. Like, I can't, or a user can't use a keyboard to do this, or the flashing animation is going to give someone a seizure, and then you can point to maybe a WCAG guideline of how to remediate that. I think when you put it in user terms, it helps to motivate why. It's not just like some abstract thing that you should do just because some expert told you to. It's that it actually impacts people who are using that framework or that product. So I try to always include something about how it's going to impact a user.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you're opening the issue too, like you gotta give a little kindness and give a little empathy, because oftentimes someone maybe hasn't done something because they're really just not aware of it. So I've seen these sort of threads devolve into like arguments where people are getting like super mad at each other, and that's never good, right? That's never productive. So yeah, what Marcy's describing, I think, is a good approach of just being like, it affects users in this way, and is there anything that we can do to like remediate that? Here's some like guidance and stuff like that.
Yeah, usually what I offer if I'm the one to open an issue is like, if I don't have time to submit a PR, I'll offer to help review whatever someone does submit, just so that you're not just like doing a drive-by, going like dropping some negative issue and then not offering to help, because often they could use your expertise, but maybe someone else has more time to actually contribute the solution. So kind of work together to help that along.
All right, this next one. Wow, how much time do we have? Are there special accessibility considerations when you have to support IE11? Maybe like we could go around and folks could share an IE11 tip or something if they have one in particular that they know about. I mean, I ran into one recently where I noticed that, or someone mentioned that if you have an SVG element, so not an image, but the actual SVG element, like inside of a button, then it'll make it a tab stop, which is sort of interesting. And so you have to put like focusable equals false or something on it. This is unique to IE11, I guess. So yeah, I'm curious if there are other IE11 considerations that folks have run into.
Oh yes, and as Melanie just mentioned, we need a therapy session. The biggest one. Oh,
sorry. Yeah, before we go into actual tips, I think it's important to point out that while for a lot of us that are at the cutting edge of design and development, anything really seems like old and passé, there's a large segment of the population that uses the web that actually has no choice, whether they're in developing countries where they haven't actually had the chance to upgrade. Not long ago, I was speaking with someone in a corporate environment in India that were still using IE9. They didn't have a choice, couldn't upgrade. And then there's a lot of people that their assistive technology really only functions with IE11 at this point. So it really is important to keep these things in mind for when we do. So to make.
Great point. So in that vein, this might motivate these tips to be more important then. I was going to say that if you're using HTML semantics, oh, I'm getting an echo somehow. If you're using like landmark elements like main or header, that you actually have to repeat role equals banner or role equals main, because IE does not expose the underlying semantics of those elements. And a great reference to look at is the HTML5accessibility.com website to see support.
Any other IE11 tips from the crowd? One thing on Nick's point, if you go look at the WebAIM, I think it's the WebAIM screen reader survey that they do every year, you can see sort of the breakdown of browsers that folks are relying on. And yeah, there is a really large IE segment still, as Nick pointed out, because a lot of assistive technology, in particular like JAWS, is really, really tuned for Internet Explorer. And it's also a very, very popular screen reader. All right. If no other IE11 tips, then we will move on. So this was a question: how well does Pally play with authentication? It looked like there were some cool things we could do with actions. Is it possible to like sign into a page maybe using Pally or something like that?
It's a bit difficult. It's kind of tricky. But one thing I know you can actually do is set some request headers. So if you're trying to get to a page that requires like an authorization header or something, you could definitely set that as one of the settings in your configuration file. And that way you should be able to at least access pages that require that kind of stuff.
You could use WebDriver too. If you're using like WebDriver, you could, it's not really an accessibility API concern. It's more of a general testing thing, but you basically just write an automated test that sets up your authentication and then run something like Pally or Axe to do the accessibility portion.
All right, so this is a question. I have two Ember questions. Both are from Scott too. One, is there an accessible orange color really? And then the other is more specific to some of the stuff Melanie was showing, which is like for route changes. You mentioned that like Ember announces those route changes in a single page app now. So Scott was wondering like, what is that experience like for the user? And I would also follow on and ask like, how do you know like how they actually implemented that, doing that kind of announcement?
So yes, you can make orange accessible. It's just very hard. If you're going to put it on a white background, it really needs to be at least like 18, 19 pixels or larger. It's like 3.95, so it's like barely in the right range, right? On black, it's a bit better. It's like a 4.7, 4.8. So that's a little more helpful. So yes, it's difficult but doable. You just have to make everything really big, which fine, right? For the routes, we haven't landed the route stuff in core just yet, but with the add-ons, the one of them will just announce the route. Right now, if you change routes in an SPA, it doesn't say anything. You don't know that, you click the link to maybe navigate, and you navigate to the new route, and you're just waiting, and it doesn't say that you navigated to the new. Oh, that sucks. So one of them does force that announcement of the route change. The other one, Ember A11y add-on, it will actually kind of narrow down the focus as you navigate through the routes. And that kind of, you have to have things set up just a certain way. So it is actually making design choices for you from an architecture perspective, but still doable. Some of the hacky stuff is around managing focus right now. And it'll just be really great to have that just, new routes there. We don't have to like trigger focus for a split second and then turn it off again before, all those kind of little hacks and tricks you have to do right now. It will be nice to have those kind of cleaned out and have a much cleaner, fluid experience.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so I have an interesting question from Scott here. On hiring people with disabilities, it's on my radar and my team, my org to do this, but he's wondering if there are any tips to get started there.
There we go. I'm unmuted. That's a fantastic question. And yeah, maybe it doesn't directly relate to JavaScript, but I think it's good stuff to keep in mind. The first thing is to realize that there's a lot of people with disabilities that are quite competent people and that actually want to work. And so it's a question to where do we find people with disabilities to hire if we want to specifically do that. It can be quite difficult, of course, because we can't say really, oh, we're only going to hire you if you're blind, or we're only going to hire you if you're missing two arms and 5 legs or something like that, right? So there's ways to reach out to different disability-related communities, whether it's a association for people who are blind or centers for independent living or these kind of things. The other thing to keep in mind is that most people with disabilities may need some accommodations to work in your office. It might be that typically you don't have a remote working culture and they need to be able to work remotely because public transit going to and from work is not reliable, or they may need a specific piece of equipment. But contrary to what most big companies fear, these accommodations cost peanuts on the dollar, really. It's just really affordable. So bottom line is, don't hesitate to reach out to different disability groups and say, hey, we're looking for a developer, we're looking for a QA tester, we're looking for a designer. Liz Jackson has just released a fantastic opportunity for designers. It's limited to New York right now, but it's called WITH, W-I-T-H, and it is trying to match designers with disabilities with product developers. And I think the more initiatives like that are out there are going to be fantastic for everyone working in accessibility and everyone that uses any products or websites and so on and so forth. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I found also going to meetups related to accessibility, like just being involved in the community itself. We just hired someone on the Chrome team because I was at an accessibility meetup recently. Someone was like, hey, I have a friend, they're blind, they're a developer, they're amazing, you should talk to them. We did, interviewed them, perfect fit for the team, so they joined, right? So just being involved in the space also creates those opportunities. Okay, let's see, we have some AOM questions, AOM questions. How do you pronounce it, AOM or AOM? That's a good one. Will we be able to use AOM to work around DOM scoping of IDs in Shadow DOM? For instance, if you're using something like ARIA labeled by today, you've got to point at another element with an ID reference. But if your thing is inside a shadow root and the label is outside the shadow root, how do you do that? So Stefan, do you want to try and tackle that?
Yeah, that's one part that I didn't cover. So that will be possible, hopefully. And I will just share the link then. So that is one of the parts, especially Shadow DOM and the boundaries there.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention, because someone else also asked how long before we see browser support for AOM. So I know that Safari is working on it, and Firefox is working on it. Safari actually has some pieces even maybe starting to show up in Safari Dev Preview. And I know Firefox is sort of like engaged in the conversation. I don't know how far along they are, but I think the exciting thing is that like we're already starting to see stuff show up in at least Chrome and Safari behind flags, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, these browser APIs they look really bad. I discovered that over the last years because browsers ship now this rolling releases, right? And every once in a while, I'm like, 6 months ago it was not supported at all, and then it's like from 1 month to the other, you're more or less green. So yeah, watching out. I think it's giving a time frame. You probably know better, but giving a time frame when we really can use it is relatively tough right now.
Yeah. Oh, the other thing to mention about AOM, I still call it AOM. AOM is that
you should establish AOM now.
I know. It's like DOM, like I hear DOM, and I just want to say AOM. So it's coming out in phases. That's sort of the plan, right? So you would probably see the ARIA properties stuff, which is like phase 1. You'd probably see that ship before anything else. Whereas computing the accessibility tree, that's all the way out in phase 4 because it's actually fairly complex. It relies on like layout and all these other things that are non-obvious. So yeah, it might be that some phases kind of happen faster than others.
It's probably worth bringing up the privacy concerns related to AOM, because for a lot of people, like even talking about it is like, whoa, because inherently if you have events that key into this accessibility layer, in a way, then you could detect someone who relies on this assistive technology who has a disability using your web app or website, and that's really encroaching on user privacy. So there's a lot of people who are like not as keen on the idea. I know for developers, it's like AOM, AOM. But for users with disabilities, there's some very serious privacy concerns. So I and many others are curious to see kind of how we balance those things, because it is really cool. But for privacy reasons, it's a little bit tricky.
But I think the idea is to have it behind a permission dialog, right? Which doesn't solve the issue completely, but at least it gives some control there.
Yeah, there's a few things that we've been talking about. So we've been meeting with on the Chrome side, we've been meeting with the like security and privacy teams, the folks who, work through a lot of the stuff related to user permissions to figure out, if a permission dialog is like fully satisfactory. For instance, what we want to avoid is the situation where the permission dialog comes up, the user says no, but then you could still sort of reverse engineer and figure out that like they actually denied the prompt, and now you still know that they are relying on assistive technology. So we're like working with the team to figure out, are there ways that we can like, fuzz it and stuff so like people can't do like tricky timing attacks and things like that. I would say, yeah, it's definitely an open question. There's a GitHub issue if you go to the AOM repo. So which is at github.com/WICG, which stands for Web Incubation Community Group. So github.com/WICG/AOM. And there's a really good discussion there with a number of folks about user privacy concerns and like ways that we could tackle that. Could we take what are currently accessibility events and actually just sort of like map them to other DOM events so it's not obvious that this came from AT? Yeah. So if anyone's interested in that, please like go to the GitHub repo and participate in that discussion. Let's see. Okay. Heather asks, is Axe using WCAG 2.1 already?
That is upcoming. We have been working on things that have wide support, especially with like, I guess that's more ARIA 1.1 land, but it is on our roadmap and will be coming up soon. I think that's set to be, it's a proposed recommendation right now, so we have a little bit of time before it becomes final. I think that's like later this summer, but yeah, I'd say stay tuned.
I have it from the WCAG working group that June is when it's going to recommendation. So a few weeks, not a few months.
Ah, perfect. Okay. I mean, okay, so that's good to know. I think it's also, we have to evaluate each one of those success criteria to see what we can actually automate. So there's a lot of things in WCAG that are necessary for accessibility, but can't be automated or programmatically determined. So for an automated testing tool, that leaves a certain percentage of things that you just can't automate. So we have to look at that in depth.
All right.
I wanted to, can I bring something up really quickly?
Please, absolutely.
So I remember, Rob, one of our first conversations about accessibility, you were saying, well, you didn't actually say this. I don't remember who actually said this to me, but it's this whole idea that it's actually the law now. And so I've seen actually a lot of small development shops get a lot of business off of just revamping the sites to make it more accessible, right? I don't remember, was it Applebee's or something else? There's been a few lawsuits on accessibility. And again, I can't remember if this was you and me talking, Rob, or me and somebody else. So information just flows through my mind.
Yeah, so it's, I should like wave my arms around right now and say, I am not a lawyer, nor should any of this be construed as legal advice. Okay.
Yes.
So in some countries, it's the law. You know, the United States, Israel, the UK have laws around accessibility. There is, it sort of depends on like the space that you're operating in as well. So for instance, like the private sector versus someone receiving like government funding and things like that. So if you're receiving, in the US at least, if you're receiving like government funding, there is a thing called Section 508, I'm totally forgetting the rest of it. 508C, 508(1), something like that, which basically has some like criteria around like what you need to do, which sort of maps to WCAG these days. In the private sector, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I think there's a little bit more sort of, again, I'm not an attorney, so someone could correct me here, but there's a little bit more gray area around that. I think what tends to happen is companies get an accessibility complaint. They often choose to address the complaint. There have been some lawsuits recently. I think Winn-Dixie was the big one where they like decided to fight it in court and lost, and then were sort of like asked by the judge to make sure that their site was WCAG compliant. But I don't think there's any like really super strict guidelines at the moment in the private sector saying you must follow a particular standard. Whereas I think it's a little bit different with 508C for government stuff. But I'm sure people on this panel can correct me and have better ideas there.
I would also throw out that even when there's no actual accessibility requirements, like a lot of people are saying, oh, well, we need to make our website ADA compliant, which is a non-starter because there's no web accessibility requirement under ADA because it's too old. And then the DOJ decided that they were going to do something, and after 7 years, they decided they wouldn't do anything. But when we're looking at that kind of approach, or places where there's no specific accessibility, web accessibility criteria, there's always the fallback that most places have anti-discrimination laws, whether it's human rights association or department and whatnot. And on that basis, it has happened over and over again that because WCAG 2.0 is the most accepted standard worldwide, that's what everything is being gauged against.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out too that for even if you aren't the company having legal action brought against you, there's market pressure to also meet some accessibility requirements. Like if your biggest competitor gets sued in the United States, that should be a wake-up call that you have an opportunity to say what an accessible experience is for your product instead of playing this game of catch-up of like, oh, geez, we got brought with legal action. We need to, figure out how to make this compliant. Compliant doesn't necessarily mean accessible or usable. So it's nice to be a bit more proactive to innovate with that and to prototype and make something that's actually delightful to use and accessible rather than just like leaving it until you get, have a lawsuit brought against you. Yeah. So if you, like I said earlier, if you can iterate and kind of chip away at it and consider it from the beginning, you can really avoid a lot of legal action because users don't want to sue you. They just want something to be accessible.
Yeah. We're talking about lawsuits, and I'm always a little bit wary about scaring companies, if you don't become accessible, you will be sued, or you might be sued, and it might cost you millions of dollars. Well, yeah, that's a reality that we have to deal with. So we shouldn't push people to come to accessibility from a perspective of fear, but there is that risk there. And if we're going to talk about risk, it's not just the company. When building lawsuits, very often the company who owns the building is getting sued. The company that built the building is getting sued. The architect company is getting sued. So if you're in a design or development agency and you have a client who is getting sued for accessibility, chances are you will also be named in the suit. So it's something to ponder. That said, I really don't like to do accessibility by scare tactics, but it's a reality.
Agreed. Well, to kind of like bridge that like fear, risk, opportunity divide, I just want to point out someone that you should start listening to, following, is Lainey Feingold. She's an attorney. She's the attorney that doesn't actually sue anyone. She has a book out called Structured Negotiation that is a must read if you're interested in the space, because she's all about being collaborative and bringing people to the table to fix things rather than litigating. And she has lots of case studies and stories in her book that are very worth your time. So I would look into that. Structured Negotiation, what's the name?
Yeah, so whenever we talk to people about building web applications and different things like that, the question is always accessibility. And usually people who are uneducated on it, right? Like, let's say startup co-founders, they're like, yeah, accessibility. Well, is it going to slow down the process of us getting this application out? What have you all done to, it's like, you should. But besides this whole idea of compliance and different things like that, especially for, I think, tech startups, right? How do we get those type of people excited and bought in?
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, please, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say that I think the fear, although we may not like it, fear is always like a good motivating factor for people. So I definitely think that's like one aspect to it, but also looking at the business side and seeing that this is something that's going to make your site available to so many more people. And I think business people understand that you will make more money if your site is more accessible more than anything. So that's one thing I would say is always like very effective, like money.
I like to sell it as your code will be maintainable for longer. Someone asked me recently, why do you like accessibility? Why do you even care about it? Like, so many people don't. It's because I like to write really great code. And I'm kind of a code perfectionist. And when my code is inclusive, it's like the ultimate getting it right. One of the things I covered in my EmberConf talk is as developers, we fight about tabs versus spaces, right? The classic developer argument. What if we had arguments about div with the role of heading and ARIA level 1 versus H1? Like, maybe that's a better argument for us to be having, because like that's which one of these pieces of code is better. So that's kind of like from my nerdy developer angle, how I like to sell it. Like, you're just going to be a better coder. Hello, obviously. But from the business perspective, there's more money for you to make. You're including more of the market in your shopping experience. So yeah, why would you want to do that? Don't you like money? Like we do, so let's do that. I don't know. That's my
Isn't there some statistic? And again, this goes back to our conversation, Rob. Like some statistic that like X percent of people around the world have some sort of disability. And so if you're not making your websites accessible, you're excluding like a very large percentage of the world.
We can play that numbers game. I was actually teaching a class at XSU yesterday, and I was going over those numbers. We're talking, an average 1 in 5 people with have disabilities in the Western world. We're talking about in Canada alone, there's the purchasing power for people with disabilities, $25 billion. Where those numbers can be bandied around. And it's really impressive, but the reality is that we actually can't really use those numbers to build a business case for accessibility, because we can't say, well, 1 in 5 people actually have a barrier on the web. We can't actually say, or we don't have access to data that will tell us how much of that spending power is actually used on the web. That said, yeah, there's a lot of people with disabilities out there. We have money to spend. Often, if a site is coded properly, it's going to be easier for people to go do grocery shopping online rather than try to fight the aisles at the grocery store, especially when everything is really crammed, it's pouring with rain, there's no parking, etc., etc. So there's definitely a business case to be made for it. I'd like to throw out a cliche, if you want, but it's quite impressive for some people that never thought about it. Google is the largest screen reader user on the planet, because they are going through your site, and if it's not the content is not available programmatically, they don't have access to it, just like a screen reader would not have access to it. So, business case for accessibility, you just increased your SEO. So, food for thoughts.
I was just going to echo the idea of avoiding technical debt, especially in like a minimum viable product startup land. If you aren't kind of chipping away and iterating at accessibility, you're going to amass this body of work that has no accessibility in it at all. And then it becomes a pretty daunting task. Whereas when you're starting with the easy thing, like your MVP each step of the way, if you include accessibility, you're going to be in way better shape if you try to reuse any of that code.
I think
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think on that, we sort of always talk about this. How do we convince people to consider that there's a whole set of users that we deny exist, right? By not providing working software for these users, we are actually denying the existence of them trying to use these tools. And I'm really looking forward to the day that we get beyond how do we convince companies and startups to actually embrace accessibility and to just acknowledge what this topic actually is, which I talked about with just John. I talked about this with Jen Weber the other day, which is that what do we define as broken software? Like, what is actually broken as far as what our standards are? And if there's a certain percentage of people who can't use it because of things that were actually possible for us to fix, then that should be redefining what broken is. It's like with Era and using Pally, if you use it in your CI, that's your standard of what actual working software is. And it goes back to exactly what Melanie was saying too. It's the pride of doing that job and actually saying, well, I made software that actually works rather than just sort of works. But I know that that's a whole different topic, but I'm just really looking forward to that paradigm shift where it's not about convincing people to acknowledge that these people exist in the first place. So yeah.
Okay, that was good. So one more question that we have. What are some best practices for development teams when you're relying on third parties for elements and components, and you're trying to make sure that that stuff sort of that you're bringing into your site is accessible?
That's a great question. I think it's very tempting to use third-party stuff. I will say that the spec or log guidelines say if you use a third-party thing, you, the person who is using it, are also responsible for making sure that it's accessible. So I know at work we've had to choose to not use some products simply because they weren't accessible, which made our product inaccessible, not conformant. So put a ticket in, put a PR in if you can. Talk with your dollars. Let them know we wanted to buy your product, but your product's inaccessible, and that's a non-starter for us. That's a really great way. I mean, we talk about this a lot, especially in America, like talk with your dollars. That's how you can do that.
I think one of the things to remember is that when you're dealing with third-party plugins or software, the first step to have is to have a large bottle of Tylenol beside you, because it can get fairly hairy fairly quickly. I worked with an airline that were dealing with several third-party plugins that they didn't have a choice to use, and one of the approach that was done is, as Melanie said, talk with the dollar, and if you have any possibility to point out to them, well, these specific elements are a massive problems, and help them help you if you're in that position to be able to do that. If you have no other alternative to use, is one approach.
So maybe last question, since we're running out of time, is future of accessibility. Maybe just a quick mentions going down each one of our speakers of what y'all think the future of accessibility holds.
Do you want to call on folks, Tracy?
Sure. Rob,
okay.
What do you think?
All right.
I'll start with you.
Okay. The thing that I'm immediately most excited about is it's AOM, specifically the virtual nodes stuff. I think that for a really long time accessibility is very, very integrated with the DOM. And increasingly we're seeing tools that just sort of use the DOM as like a rendering target. And so the actual markup that you get is very all over the place. And so it can be very hard to like get the specifics of ARIA correct for some of those custom controls. So I'm very interested to see AOM applied directly to custom elements or React components or anything like that. I don't think it exclusively has to be for Canvas. And to see if that actually helps us like get a leg up on building accessible components a bit faster.
Awesome. What about you, Erie?
Yeah, Rob actually stole what I was about to say because I watched his talk at Eyeo, and that was something that actually really blew my mind. But what I would say I'm probably the most excited for in general is just the new improvements to developer tools, because that always makes it so much easier for me to do my work, or for people in general just to get started. So one of the things that was really cool was the new accessibility color inspector. And that was something that previously you'd have to like use a completely separate tool to try and make sure that your colors have the right contrast ratio and all of that. And just anything that makes accessibility easier to do is just what I'm really looking forward to.
Awesome. Thank you so much. What about you, Marcy?
Yes. Well, I'm super big on automation. Lots of tooling things, but I feel like that kind of we hit the end of what's possible once you get to screen reader testing. So what I would like to see, what I'm excited about, is more automation of actual assistive technologies. I've heard that there is a thing from Freedom Scientific called JAWS Inspect that I need to look into. It is a product that I believe you have to pay money for, so kind of like makes it harder for people to get started. But I just met with the Edge team on Monday and kind of put a bug in their ear that maybe since they're at the platform level, that maybe there's an opportunity for them to automate Narrator, which is the platform screen reader in Windows. So we'll see if anything comes of that. I kind of just like threw, lobbed an idea out at them and they seemed pretty into it. So kind of spilled that one, but that's the direction I'd like to go. And having other assistive technologies do something similar would be great. Like if VoiceOver, if you could have some assertions in your automated tests That would probably have to be written in AppleScript, so I don't know how feasible that is. Maybe MVDA and Python. But I think if anyone's looking for a research project, that would be a huge way to move automated testing forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think just re-emphasizing that all voices matter. So if you care about these things, commenting on GitHub or doing anything like that, or just speaking up, or just going to a meetup and talking to speakers about the different things you care about, or bugging the Chrome team on Twitter, you know, those types of things go much further than you could even ever imagine. What about you, Melanie?
For me, I got really excited around some of the elders of the internet, I guess, so to speak. People have been doing this for 20 plus years, who are very interested in, gosh, we've been talking about this problem for a really long time. Why don't we make the really fast solutions also accessible? So the energy of things like virtual viewport on data tables, where you really need a way to do 5,000 rows really fast, and that's not accessible though. So how do you do that? And the energy I'm seeing around, hey, why don't we just make that accessible? What do we have to do to make that happen? The future of that excites me. And that so many people are just like, I don't know, finally paying attention or paying more attention or something. I think we're going to get some really smart solutions that are going to be around for a really long time. So that is very exciting.
Cool. But what does your cat think about it?
Yeah. He wants
She's
attention.
Like,
yeah.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Next up, Stefan.
Yeah, for me, the future is what I see, and what I want to see is just that I feel like I'm coming from a web performance angle, and it was kind of cool to be fast, and I'm kind of feeling that we're now slowly reaching the state where it has to be fast, and it has also it has to be accessible. And I've been at a lot of events, and there's usually 1 or 2 accessibility talks included these days, or at least the last events I've been to. And I'm really excited that it's just like that it's this set of things you have to do to build good, accessible products for everybody. So that it's these things you have to do. And I feel like we're on a good way there. And yeah, that's what I'm excited about.
Cool. I'm like way excited about the kitty is really what I'm excited about. I want to play with the baby. Okay, so next up, what about Suze? What are you excited about for the future?
I think that components have been talked about a lot today. And for me, I think that components are the most powerful effect that we can have on accessibility, because the way that we're going with the front-end frameworks like Vue and React and Ember and Angular and Dojo with their accessible components, it's just like if you make a packaged up piece of reusable code, it's just amazing what a multiplier effect that has. And so if something is implemented properly the first time and we make it culturally cool to be accessible as a component, then, you know, if you build that once and then, you know, thousands of people on their dev teams use it, that is, to me, is the least amount of effort for the biggest amount of payoff. So as soon as components became like a proposed spec for browsers and things like that, I've just been so excited, because I see that is doing so much of the heavy lifting, which are the issues that we've always talked about, which is how does everyone just justify putting much more effort into things than they normally would. And yeah, so I'm excited about, I guess, accessibility being a cool feature of a component and part of your matrix when you're evaluating those components, kind of what we were talking about before.
That is so true. And I think last up we have Nick. What are you excited about for the future?
Well, the first thing is I want to repeat what I've been saying a lot, is that in my ideal world, we would be doing such a good job that we would put ourselves out of a job. So we would not actually need accessibility experts. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, so we can be sure that we still can pay our mortgage for a little bit. But the future, I think we have to keep an eye out on all the work around AI that is going to significantly change how we experts in the field are doing the work we're doing. It's going to have an impact on, alt text and captions and a whole range of things. I think that's going to be really impactful on us, and I actually think that's exciting.
Well, y'all are definitely making a difference on me and accessibility, and this whole idea that maybe we should be doing accessibility training for people or something like that to help promote it more in the community. So super happy to help, whether on anything related to this.media. We should probably do these more often to get updates. It seems like there's a lot of stuff happening on an ongoing basis. So hopefully we can start doing these things quarterly and things like that. And yes, Marcy, annually. Quarterly? Ambitious? I feel like quarterly is less ambitious.
Weekly.
Yeah, exactly, right. And again, there's so many different amazing resources. I don't know if there's, does anybody know about like a compiled list of accessibility resources? Susan, it looks like you're shaking your head yes.
Yeah, A11yproject.com tends to be the one that a lot of people talk about, just because it is a very accessible and approachable website, and it's being continually updated. I see sometimes I get included on commits if someone found some article that I wrote from a while ago, and usually that's within like 2 weeks of me publishing that article, which is crazy. So I just think it's a really cool resource. If we could pop that into the chat, that'd be great. And then there's another one that Eyeo just recommended to you.
Yeah. If you can pop that in, I'll go ahead and include it in the show notes. So y'all are so amazing. Okay, let me try to list off. No, I'm not going to do it. I will put your all's Twitter handles in in the event description, so everybody can do that. If anybody wants to continue this conversation, feel free to hashtag This.JS. Find everybody on Twitter. And we look forward to many more exciting things related to accessibility. And thank you all for making such a big difference in our lives. This is so important, and hopefully it's as cool and awesome. I think it's happening already, right? But this idea that PWA is so like you should all do it, right? It just sort of becomes a standard in our web development. I'm really hoping that accessibility becomes the same thing with everyone's efforts. Awesome. Well, with that, again, you can follow us on Twitter at This.media. Feel free to check that out and stay tuned for the next state of events. And thank you so much again.